When it comes to video games, music is one of the most important parts of the experience. The difference good music makes is the difference between playing a game and being immersed in a game. Simply put, it allows us to emotionally invest ourselves in what is otherwise a very complex collection of ones and zeros. But that begs the question of how we're emotionally invested in the first place. We can generally name the emotion we associate with the particular music of a game soundtrack, but how do we come to that emotion initially? There are two main opinions here. That emotion is conveyed by music, and that emotion is elicited by music. As with most things, the answer isn't so simple, and it's probably a mix of both. But what is it about a particular piece of music that makes it elicit an emotion as opposed to simply conveying it? Video games offer us a uniquely useful medium to answer this question because of their interactivity. Our ability to dynamically alter parts of our experience through our choices gives us the opportunity to answer that previous question. But we have a problem. Video games are not a monolith, and so there isn't one way to simply analyze video games. We need categorization, and specifically categorization based on the degree of freedom a player has within a game. Simply put, we are asking, how does the genre of a video game affect the emotional response a player has to its music? Before we continue, however, I want to clarify what I mean when I talk about elicited and conveyed emotions, and more specifically what is required for an emotion to be considered elicited or conveyed. For our purposes, a conveyed emotion is one transmitted to the listener from the composer via a musical composition, whereas an elicited emotion is one created by the listener in reaction to a composition. Skyrim is a role-playing game released in 2011 by Bethesda Softworks. In it, you play as the Dragonborn, a hero destined to fight his namesake, and more specifically Alduin, the chief dragon, as they attempt to take over the world. The music of the game is meant to immerse the player into the world of Skyrim. The most obvious way it does this is through the instrumentation selection. The music is composed of flutes, drums, harpsichords, and other instruments with a medieval timbre. Take a listen. The game even features diegetic music that, while simpler, still employs those same instruments. Simply put, the music sounds like it could have been made by the inhabitants of Skyrim. But timbre isn't the only thing that ties the soundtrack to the world. The soundtrack also has some narrative elements baked into itself. This piece, for example, is meant to represent hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. The male voices here represent that adversity, in the context of the game being Alduin and the Dragon Menace, which sets the somber tone of this music. Later, however, female voices replace the males, representing hope and light in the face of that challenge. Eventually, these two voices join together, representing a union that in Skyrim is the Dragonborn and Alduin's final battle. But for an even less subtle example, you don't need to look further than the combat music. In Skyrim, combat music plays whenever an enemy is close by. However, dragons, being a centerpiece of the story and especially powerful enemies, have their own unique combat music, which features lyrics sung in their language. Skyrim is a very linear game, with no real player input during the main quest, narratively speaking. There's only one ending, and you can only achieve that ending one way. Because dragon combat is so intimately tied to that story, the music that accompanies it also does. The lyrics here reference your role as Dragonborn, including your relationship towards dragons and the ultimate end of the game's main story. The Dragonborn is an identity you need to fit into, not the other way around. Because of this, the music is tailored towards that pre-made Dragonborn identity, and the player's emotional reaction is dictated by how immersed into that identity they have become. Skyrim's music helps you become immersed not just into the game, but into the identity itself, which is how it conveys emotional reactions to the player. But not every RPG follows such a rigid formula. In fact, some of them were made to explicitly eschew such rigid boundaries. UNDERTALE, an RPG released in 2015 by Toby Fox, was created with the intent that you didn't have to kill anyone if you didn't want to. This emphasis on player choice gives the game multiple different endings, broadly categorized as the pacifist, neutral, and genocide routes. Undertale's story is heavily character-focused, with characters behaving in different ways depending on the choices you make. For example, Undyne can, depending on your choices, either be a steadfast friend and ally, or one of the hardest enemies in the game. This variability means that Toby couldn't center his music around the protagonist, because there effectively is no one protagonist to center. Instead, he drew connections to various characters and themes across all the different story paths using leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are themes within a piece of music tied to a concept or person. Their usage allows the listener to automatically associate a piece of music with that theme, should it contain said leitmotif. Undertale is chock full of these, from those associated with characters and areas, to broader themes and concepts as well. The first leitmotif players will hear is called Once Upon a Time, and can be thought of as the main theme of Undertale. Appearing during the prologue, the leitmotif is immediately repeated during the name creation screen. This repetition creates a sense of familiarity that makes the Undertale theme one of home and safety. This leitmotif is found at checkpoints throughout the game to make the player feel safe and relaxed. It also appears in the theme of the Pacifist Route's final boss, Azrael. At first glance, Azrael is an absolute nightmare for the player. He's totally invincible, and is thus by far the strongest opponent you've faced, and yet the player is instantly greeted with the leitmotif representing home and safety, the seeming antithesis of what's going on. As the situation becomes more hopeless, that same leitmotif persists, conveying a message of hope to the player, that all their friends are here with them, and that they can do this. As the fight progresses, another leitmotif can be heard, known as his theme. What some may not know is that this leitmotif can be heard way earlier in the game, when the player shows an act of compassion towards a statue in the rain. This theme of compassion is brought back in a fight against an opponent with seemingly no concept of compassion, which conveys to the player that he isn't totally gone. True enough, the fight ends with Azrael breaking down, admitting his loneliness and sadness to the player, and feeling compassion again. But while leitmotifs alone convey an emotion, it is their connection to the game's themes that causes some elicitation as well. Returning to the pacifist fight, you only go this route when you actively choose not to kill a single monster. This means that, when Azrael breaks down, and the narrative of compassion and mercy wins out, your approach to the game is vindicated. Azrael wasn't just saved, he was saved by you, by your actions. For lack of a better word, this elicits a sense of achievement not present in games with only one approach to the story. Ultimately, Undertale uses leitmotifs to convey and elicit emotions based on the narrative circumstances they find themselves in at the time. It pushes the boundaries of what it means for a game to be about role-playing. But what about games that don't feature any roles to play in the first place? Sid Meier's Civilization VI is the latest installment in a series of games centered around human history. It is part of what is known as the 4X genre, which is characterized by the player controlling a particular faction in a top-down world, competing with various other factions to win the game. In Civ 6, the player controls one of many civilizations, both modern and ancient, in a bid to achieve one of the 5 victory types. While the specifics of a particular victory are different for each one, they all generally require you to advance throughout the game. This advancement is the game's equivalent to a narrative, because a competitive genre like 4X can't really feature a traditional storyline. Instead, players in Civ 6 create their own timeline, which often deviates from the historical record. The music of Civ 6 is also heavily centered around advancement. Every civilization has their own theme, which is based on a tune from their history. Throughout the game, the music of a civilization will advance with it, picking up new instruments and complexity. For instance, when starting a game as America, this is your theme. It's homophonic, yet simple, with only a banjo and fiddle playing the melody and lots of reverb. Towards the end of the game, however, this is your theme. It's still homophonic, but the old duet has been replaced by an arrangement of strings, drums, synths, and many other instruments, while still staying faithful to the core melody. This is clearly another example of leitmotif, but unlike Undertale, in which the leitmotifs refer back to concepts or characters important to the story, the leitmotifs of Civ 6 just refer to the civilizations themselves. This is an important distinction because of how nebulous those civilizations are in any particular game. For example, Russia's Atomic Era theme sounds like this. Now, you may have some initial reactions to the music, but you're also not playing the game. When actually playing the game, this music can take on a whole different meaning depending on your relationship with Russia. What might sound like a nation finally ascending to greatness, bringing with it feelings of hope and satisfaction, can also sound like a formidable threat rising to power. That's because the music itself just conveys advancement, whereas the game's variable nature causes the music to elicit a particular meaning to a player based on their circumstances. Ultimately, it seems that narrative structure necessarily creates conveyance and stifles elicitation. So then, What about a game with no narrative structure at all? Minecraft is a sandbox game created by Marcus Persson in 2011. Often compared to playing with Legos, Minecraft features no narrative story at all, boasting an infinite world that players can project their own ideas onto. Now, despite the sandbox nature, Minecraft has a few characteristics that a composer could latch onto to create thematically appropriate music. The technology the player creates is roughly medieval, so maybe include some horns and lutes like Skyrim. But the game's art is very simple and pixelated, so maybe take a leaf out of Undertale's book and use chiptune. With this in mind, what does Minecraft's music sound like? It doesn't sound like anything you'd predict. Minecraft's music is mostly a combination of piano and various synthesized instruments. Much like the game they're in, these songs are rather aimless and calm, but it's difficult to categorize them or even articulate exactly how they make you feel. Minecraft also gives very little context for its music. It has no separate music for combat, sleeping, mining, or crafting. The only distinctions are whether the player is in the nether, the end, underwater, the main menu screen, and creative mode. And while the music for these conditions differs, they all share the same qualities of ambiguity I mentioned earlier. This lack of context makes it difficult for Minecraft to have much to convey in the first place. Ironically, this general absence conveys a sense of emptiness, a blank canvas for the player to paint on. Minecraft music generally features a slower tempo, with most songs ranging from 70 to 90 BPM. It's lyricless and melodically simple, all of which makes it blend well into the background of the game. As Minecraft has no story, the player has to naturally create their own narrative based on what they're doing. These narratives are so simple you probably wouldn't even classify them as one, but they function the same way said narratives do in other games. The player creates their own history of what exactly they're doing in the game, and forms connections to the area as a result. This narrative naturally elicits a whole range of emotions to match, and as all of this is done in the subconscious of the player, it's not unlike how emotion is elicited in Civ 6. The player derives some sense of accomplishment or wonder at the world they inhabit and the changes they have manifested. Minecraft is basically as close as you can get to have a soundtrack that purely elicits emotion. Now, if we ordered the soundtracks discussed based on their ratios of conveyed to elicited emotions, it would look something like this. The trend here shows that, as games focus less on narrative storytelling, they convey less and elicit more emotion. Sure, some Skyrim music may elicit a feeling of nostalgia, but you can be nostalgic for anything. It's not tied to the game itself. The elicitation of music requires a personal connection between the listener and the music, which in video games is formed through personal choice. To put it in simpler terms, the more involved you were in the creation of the narrative, the more that narrative will elicit emotions from you.